Hello, hello. Hello, hello, hello. Hello. Oh, hello, hello. Okay. This hello, hello. Hello, hello.
Hello. Cassidy.
Saw you. Okay, one
There
sec.
you go. Okay,
I
I
just
can hear
turned my
you.
microphone on. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now let me test together. How about, does this one work too?
Yep.
Okay. And then does the frame, like, do you see this, but also us?
No, so hold on. Let me make my screen as big as I can. So no, it would need to, you need to move this, the camera over
Here.
to towards the computer more. Just like one or two little clicks.
Sec. Okay, everything you're saying, I can't, I can't hear. Maybe if I go on my phone. Just calling Ginny. She's making sure everything's
Hi,
looking
Matt.
good. She's right there. Yeah. I just can't hear her.
Hello.
Oh, you can't hear me?
I can't hear you, no.
Oh, I can hear you.
Yeah, I think
Wait,
it's because I've made it so all the, well, no, you're an organizer, so you should be able
hold
to.
on. Maybe it's just my stupid computer again.
Maybe it's, well, it's probably mine knowing me. Yeah, that's perfect. And then we'll just put it on. Once you put it in, yeah, we'll turn it on. Yeah. Okay. So what were you saying? Was there any, you can see everything okay?
Um, yes, I can see everything perfectly. Actually, I see his whole
Yeah.
setup and the screen, so that's good.
Okay, awesome. And you can hear both of us. Because I will turn my mic off, of course.
And,
Oh yeah, go ahead.
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear Matt.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay, excellent. Well,
Awesome. Is it
I'm
starting at
glad-
6:30 or 7?
6:30.
Oh, okay, cool.
There's 2 people in the waiting room for Microsoft Teams, but no one's here in person yet. We had 10 people sign up. So I'm hoping they, oh, I see my mom actually.
Yeah,
Nice.
we usually get like half the amount of people, but
Nice. I sent out a
yeah.
reminder yesterday and today, so
Okay.
hopefully they
No, that's
see
good.
that.
That would be nice. And just, yeah, tell Matt too, he can like send us an invoice or whatever for his speaking.
Okay, perfect. I will let him know actually right now.
Oh, yay. Well, I'll just
Yay.
stay on and listen.
Okay. Sounds good. Thanks for checking. Okay. Okay, bye. Okay. And she just reminded us that once you're home, just send us the invoice too, and
Oh, sure.
we'll
Yep.
get that to you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I'm gonna make sure people are coming through. I see one person parking.
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna turn my microphone.
Should I turn mine off too? Yes.
Is yours on as well? Okay. One last check and then I'll come and we'll get started.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You don't want it there. Sometimes you anyway. But no time you got your. No, we.
Okay, you ready?
Orange tree. and-
Awesome.
Awesome. Okay, we'll get started.
It had beautiful oranges. Oh, well, pick one.
Okay, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining
Hello.
in person and hello, everyone virtually online. I see all of you. So welcome to tonight's Green Living Workshop. We are very lucky to have Matt here with us. He's going to walk us through prepping our yard for the changing season. So I'm Cassidy. I'm with the town of Okotoks, the projects and programs specialist. And yeah, I'll pass it over to Matt. He is with Grown Home Garden. So if you didn't grab his business card, it's definitely right there and a little fridge magnet before you leave. And then halfway through the presentation, I will also come around just to show you a little thing that Matt wants you guys to take a look at. But without further ado, Matt, take it
Fantastic.
away.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As you see, we are in unprecedented times when October is as spectacular as the beginning of September. So there's lots of joys and there's lots of challenges when next week we get like a foot of snow. So there's a lot of challenges in Alberta. I have been here my whole life. I lived up in Grand Prairie for a short period of time. And the whole province, but especially Southern Alberta, has these unique challenges that every one of us face. And getting really good information, I have found, really just helps prepare people to have a full idea and scope of what they're looking for their yard. So without further ado, in courtesy of my gorgeous fiance. So first, we're going to go through the brief introduction. I'll kind of run through a little bit more about myself. We'll talk about some of the fall activities. We'll also go through some of the fall preparations, preparing for winter, what you're looking for in spring, and then afterwards some Q&A. So I opened Grown Home this year, but it's kind of been on the books for the last few years since the beginning of COVID. Significant amount of people got into gardening right at the start. Fantastic idea. A lot of them failed miserably. And no one ever told them that that's the whole point of gardening. You learn through failures, you learn through successes, you learn and you adapt and you overcome. So I started Grown Home primarily to help people understand how to grow not only food, but to overcome a lot of kind of the misinformation or the limitations that some people present, and just how to have more food security at your home so you're less reliant on the grocery store. I have a bachelor's of environmental sciences, conservation biology was my major, and I took my master gardener program through the University of Alberta. Very much thoroughly enjoy it, and then they cut the program a year after I took mine. So you can still take it, but very educational, very diverse, and it helped me understand all of the challenges that I would come across. And then I took that right into consultation, estimation, and from there doing maintenance and then starting my own business. So one of the first things that a lot of people think when fall comes around is I gotta clean up my garden, I'm done for the year. There is a significant amount of fall crops that you can still continue all the way into and past frost that really just give heavy amounts of nutrients. They're really resilient plants. And it's really nice to just get whatever extension we can in our short season. So one of the big ones that comes out is kale and the brassicas. There are a lot of varieties of broccolis and different kinds that will have, instead of one gigantic head that takes 100 days, you can have a 60-day crop where you're getting multiple stems. You can prune them as you go and you can harvest as you eat, so that all of that is fresh, nutrient dense, as close to perfection as you can get. Anything you get from the store, you have that delay, you have that challenge. Obviously, spinach, incredibly high in vitamin C. Not a lot of people know that. There are a lot of varieties that just give you a lot of resilience to common disease and pests, and there's a substantial amount of sizes and varieties you can play around with in a decorative sense as well with a lot of these. But basically just having a diverse amount of nutrients available whenever you want, as long as you're protecting them through the frost, and their resilience helps that process. Root vegetables, especially onions, carrots, beets, we see a big shift in their sugar content as we get into frost. So if you've ever had a carrot that's been in the soil through a frost, the taste is just next level. They're a preparing mechanism that allows them to resist the frost damage itself, but it's an amazing opportunity for us to eat really, really delicious, high quality root vegetables. And then last, the garlic. Garlic is this best to deal with in the fall, best to prep and plant in the fall, just because that advantage it gets in the spring is miles ahead of any other variety you're going to plant in the spring, garlic wise. I do have a product that I created that essentially you can sprout that garlic, have it kind of sit on a windowsill, and you can enjoy garlic scapes, green onions all year during the winter. But it is something that definitely you want to prepare for in fall. And there are a lot of tools that make it very easy to plant very quickly. So fall soil care predominantly circles around one concept and idea, and this has been central to Grown Home and kind of where I'm taking the business, is that we don't grow plants, the soil grows the plants. Our job is to grow the soil. Soil conditioning and building the soil is one layer where you add amendments and you add compost, those kind of things. The main benefit of that is you're feeding microbes, bacteria and fungi that will work together with plants to basically mutually benefit, where the plant will give sugar that these microbes can consume, and these microbes will then either release chemicals that bind the soil and allow the soil to be more moisture absorbent or to hold more nutrients. But also with fungi, you get these diverse networks where you'll actually have two completely separate plants connect and are able to transfer and move nutrients back and forth. So having and prioritizing soil ecology is one of the biggest ways that you can take the hassle, the struggle, and the difficulty out of gardening, and one of my big focuses. Amendments are a big, important consideration. There are some diversity between, for instance, compost and manure, whether you're looking for a living amendment where they're called nutrient pumps, or weeds, as we like to call them, where they're basically designed to take these open patches of soil, drive nutrients up, condition that soil, and then allow it to get some cover, and over time have this protective cover that without it, you start getting depth and depth and depth of death of those microbes, and you get crusting on top of the soil as rain and compaction prevents anything from really getting in there meaningfully. So there are a lot of different kinds of mulches and covers you can place on top of soil. They have a lot of different functions and purposes, both aesthetic and functional. But the idea is mainly if you can understand where and how to best use them, you can either prevent damage to certain plants, or you can just take a lot of hassle out of the equation by preventing any of these windblown seeds, or especially with cedar mulch, you can actually have the seeds prevent from germinating because of a chemical that's released naturally by the wood. So you can actually just make your gardening easier by putting the right kind of mulch on top. And there's a very old, but also very recent adaptation of something called no-till gardening. And it's hopefully going to be the future because it has significant potential to just build that soil health back, where we normally just tear up and till and remove up to 50% of the microbes in that soil each time we expose it that way. pH is a big consideration. pH drives and affects what nutrients are available on a molecular level and what dissolves into and is accessible by those roots. So a big consideration is getting an idea, especially with some kind of soil test, a more advanced soil test, what you have in place, because that's where you'll start building or adapting or amending to better complement what you already have. In Alberta, predominantly we have clay all the time. And it's very, very basic. Fertilization. So there's a lot of different forms you can get fertilization in, kind of quick, more slow release, longer term, and then either a chemical base, or you can get more of an organic or natural based addition of nutrients to your soil. And then aeration is a huge consideration, again, for those microbes, because a lot of, if you think of like a stinky compost pile that isn't being turned, that lack of air is what's actually driving the growth and development of those unhealthy bacteria that are creating that smell. But a very well aerated compost has very little smell at all. So for amendments, there are a big delineation between kind of a traditional compost, something you might find at Home Depot or a big box store, and raw manure. So I just wanted to touch on the idea that if you're looking at compost, it has a lot of very effective nutrients. It already has usually some ecology in it, and you're getting a lot of balance in moisture retention, soil conditioning. You get a lot of values out of that one amendment. The contrast of that is manure, which has much, much more nutrients, still has a lot of organic material, still has a lot of that function. But a big consideration is if it's not well aged, or if it's not an amendment that has had time to kind of break down or let those nutrients, you can burn your soil, you can cause a lot of damage to your plants. And that consideration is if you can find someone, farmer, stable, that they're just basically putting it into a pile, letting it go for a few years and just cycling through, usually they just want to get rid of it. So you can usually just kind of chat them up, go and pick it up in a dump truck, pickup truck, whatever you're looking for, and they're happy to get rid of it. Oh, and for cover crops, there is a big consideration for how and what weeds, as we call them, establish, and there is a very not well appreciated concept of the depth that these roots will get to. So if you think of a thistle or a dandelion and how deep they will go, all they're doing is getting into that more parent material. They are spreading out, collecting nutrients, and driving that growth upwards. That's why they're so persistent. That's why they want to come back each year, because they're trying to do their job. We just don't want them because we're not utilizing them in the way that they should be utilized. And I'll talk a little bit more about how they actually can be utilized in a more effective way to complement your garden instead of being a hassle in it. For mulching, there's a few considerations, what kind of material, where you're using it. So I am a big proponent of not using landscape fabric. I know that in the industry, it's pretty common. The only time I will recommend using it is if you have rock. If you have decorative rock in the front yard, you need something that's going to prevent it from moving into the soil from the weight. But other than that, you're really limiting your ability to access the roots. So if you ever have quackgrass, if you have creeping bellflower, they have no problem just growing right underneath. And if you look under a microscope, they're just a spear tip. And they're just looking for whatever hole, whatever little spot they can find. They'll pop right through, no problem. And then they will do their horrible things that they do. Mulching actually will limit how deep they go, because that soil quality in that upper layer, when it's protected, really just signals to the plant, I don't need to find water. I don't need to prepare. This is really nice material. And really all you need to do is just go over, loosen the soil a little bit, and the whole root system will come out. And I've actually found that in the more infested areas, it's actually easier to weed than it is just small little sections. The idea being the first year you might remove 90%, then the next year you're dealing with that 10, then that goes down to 2, and then you don't have a problem anymore. So it is a very manageable thing when you can cover the soil and give it the ability to do what it does best. because it's really hard to find a forest where there's bare open soil. pH has a big effect, a very big effect, and there's a limiting factor in the time that it takes to condition that soil back to something that's more pH balanced. So in Alberta, we typically skew a little bit higher in the alkaline, above 7. Regions where you see a lot of spruce trees or conifers, you'll see that decrease in pH. It just means that the chemical reactions going on are either binding or releasing certain nutrients at certain times. And the big challenge is conditioning with either a natural compost material like peat moss or something like elemental sulfur, which will change that pH over time. A big consideration is in the fall. You want that space where you don't have a plant in the ground when you're conditioning soil. So it's really nice in the fall to do these amendments and preparations because you don't want to burn or hinder or limit any of the plants that you are growing in the active season. Horticultural lime specifically, I want to make a note of that for the alkaline. There are different forms of lime. Horticultural lime is a specific variety. If you have the other kinds of lime, it can do damage. It can bind chemicals up, nutrients up, and essentially do a lot of damage. So just making sure you're sourcing the correct version of a sulfur or a lime is a really big thing to focus on. And what can help that process is soil testing. So what I recommend, if you've never gardened before, if you just want to double check after many, many years of not amending or doing a lot of work, it's worth the money, it's worth the time. There is a lab, Down to Earth, I believe, labs in Lethbridge. And what they do is they have a mail order bag. They mail it to you. You take the samples as directed, you mail it back to them, and they'll do a full analysis for about $70. And that will give you not only nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, it gives you organic material, electrical conductivity, and will break down all of the trace minerals that all of those plants may or may not need and give you those amounts so you know where and exactly how you can best amend your soil. Without that, you're kind of limited to pH strips, more, again, big box store where you have your tiny little meter. And for some people it works. I haven't found a lot of success because I want to know the full diversity of nutrients so that I know if there's any issues or problems I need to address before they start damaging my plants. With fertilization, not a lot of people are aware that the fertilize in spring, monthly fertilizer package kind of thing. Liquid fertilizers have about 10% of their nutrients transferred to the plants. They're water-based, so essentially the second that they hit the soil, they just start trickling down. There isn't a lot of transference for the value you pay. So where I have found a lot of efficacy is that if you move towards a foliar spray, what you're doing is you're placing a very diluted concentration of these high quality nutrients right in the growing point. You're putting it right on the leaf where it can almost instantly start being absorbed. They're effective for about 3 weeks, assuming you don't have heavy rains. And the technique that I use is more of a higher pressure. So I have this basically a Ryobi sprayer that creates enough pressure to move and jostle the leaves around, but not enough to actually damage the plant. So you get full coverage under the leaf as well, and those nutrients can actually persist through a rainstorm or any kind of adverse weather we might have. Slow release fertilizer. Oh, sorry. And with foliar applications, 90% of those nutrients go into the plant as opposed to the 10% from liquid. With slow release fertilizers, they definitely complement each other. I really enjoy them because it takes time, it takes nature, it takes weather to start releasing those nutrients. So it complements that foliar application where if you're getting it washed off, it still goes into the soil, but it's also activating that slow release fertilizer. And then you can really complement that with some compost or something that's going to bind or hold those nutrients a little bit longer in the soil. Organic wise, I'm not a huge proponent. I know that there's definitely a time and a place. And it is healthy to understand that if we're just artificially adding chemicals, it's kind of like only eating McDonald's. You're getting nutrients. Are they as diverse or what your body needs to be able to resist disease or to grow to your optimum? There's a challenge in that space. What I've actually found and what I complimented before was that if you're pulling out those really nutrient dense weeds, there's a technique in Korea that has been used for hundreds of years where you basically collect all of your weeds, your clippings, your pruning, put it into a bucket, add water, stir it up. If you're aerating that process, you have the right kind of bacteria breaking down the right kind of plant. And essentially, you can then take that, dilute it with some more water, and it becomes your liquid fertilizer. So I don't want to put landscaping companies out of business, but those plants are performing well in your yard. If you see a weed that's a big problem weed, it means that it's doing its job really well. It's conditioned for your soil and it's moving the right nutrients in the right way. So if you harvest that and then put it back into or onto your plants, you're just putting that value right back in for pennies, pennies on the dollar. Aeration, as I said before, is a huge impact, especially with the tea, because if you are not getting air, the microbes can't survive. The plants will suffer and struggle. They do breathe through their leaves, but they need to have open, accessible soil. And a big part of that is just aerating. So I don't really recommend a lot of rototilling, just because what you're doing is conceptually breaking up the soil, but you're also breaking up those fungi networks, you're disturbing all of these bacteria, and you're essentially killing half of their population and delaying how long it takes for them to recover and come back. So especially if you do that in the fall, you can significantly limit their ability to survive over winter. There is a time and a place, definitely, if you're putting in new gardens or if you're just wanting to have an open patch of soil that you can do new plantings in. There's a time and a place. Something to consider is that as a larger rototiller moves through the soil, it's actually compacting the soil about 18 inches down, or however deep those paddles go. And the idea then is you essentially have that loosened, nice soil, and then just this solid barrier. So any roots will take many, many more years to be able to penetrate through. It'll take more time. And really, you can limit the accessibility of oxygen underneath and the passage of worms and other ecology that really are just going to bring up nutrients and cycle everything through anyways. With manual aeration, I should make a note of that. There are some really handy boots and shoe clips that essentially you can just walk around your yard and you're just poking holes. The idea, it doesn't really matter how. There are machine versions. There are broad forks or larger. The less you disturb the soil, the better. So my recommendation, at least in a garden sense, if you have a broad fork, which is essentially just this gigantic U shape with tines coming down, and you hold it with two hands, put it into the ground and just pull back. It's very casual and easy. But the idea is that it's leaving clumps. It's opening up deeply into the soil, but those clumps are these kind of colonies of bacteria and microbes that essentially can just pop right back out and they can start reestablishing, and it takes a lot less stress on them in that format to allow them to bounce back. Frost is one of the most challenging things, and a lot of people will have horror stories of how they will plant out or they are just hoping to finish off their tomatoes and frost blows in and everything goes. There are a lot of solutions you can preemptively address that with, one of which, cold frames, especially in our climate, you can push a month and a half. You can almost get to mid-December if the outside environment is half decent. Because what it's doing is it's creating a small little climate zone for whatever's growing in there, where you're not getting wind, you're not getting the direct frost impact, and fall crops can just extend even further into the into the cold. Row covers are a really good solution, and I find kind of the emergency backup. If you have planted out or you have small little shrubs that are just starting to leaf out in the spring or just holding on in the winter or in the fall, essentially you just cover them. Similar concept. You're reducing air, you're reducing that effect that the frost will have. And a lot of people don't know that if you actually lightly mist them, what it will do is that cold that normally would go into the plant is collected by that. As that water freezes, it takes that energy and holds that energy. So you can actually get a little bit further into a frost and not actually have damage to your plants. Mulch, again, is a big consideration, mainly for the roots, but also if it's insulating, which is the main value of mulch. If it's insulating, you're just going to give those roots a better temperature resistance so that if there is light frost damage on top and then it bounces back, you can always have a plant regrow from frost if the roots are doing what they can do. It's when we get these nightly temperatures that just start freezing the ground, that's when we lose that value. So just a review, soil test, always recommended. It helps to know where you start. From there, choosing where and how you want to amend, whether it's slow, medium, fast. Aeration or non-aeration. If you're choosing to do so, I highly recommend buying some worms, helping the bugs that will stir and move that soil, because a lot of the work nature will do for you and will take that hassle out. And then finally, applying mulch, some kind of cover, whether that's living or whether that's just a static cover. Both have value. There's definitely more applicability, I find, with a static mulch, just because there is some maintenance and there is some work that has to be done with managing cover crops that are alive. With lawn care, I appreciate the value of people who really love their lawn. They're gorgeous. There's a time and a place for them. I absolutely appreciate it. If I could have my merry way, I would convert everybody's front yard into a vegetable garden and we would all live happily ever after. That being the case, I want to give good information about what and how you can do to prepare your lawn to best handle the cold that we have. Some of the key concepts that I would like to talk about are the depth or the height that you have the grass at frost. There's an important consideration where you want to avoid things called scalping, where you either cut it so low that you're exposing the root material, which can drive cold directly into the roots, kill patches off in your yard. And if you don't have some kind of barrier that's collecting snow, however, it is challenging to have mice and vole. Without that protective layer, if we have a nice Chinook that cooks off all the snow, there's nothing in place protecting those roots. So leaving a decent amount, usually 2 to 3 inches is fine. And as you go through the fall, you want to go from kind of your normal summer height. Here, especially with the droughts that we've had and the challenges of water restrictions, letting your grass grow a little bit longer is always a good idea. It just allows it to be a little healthier and more resilient, and that extra height will actually hold more of that moisture in place and prevent it from evaporating off. As the season progresses, you just want to systematically lower that to about 2 to 3 inches. Aeration, again, huge value. You want to make it so that whatever amendments you might put on the soil, the term top dressing is where you put a tiny little layer of either compost or really rich organic material. If you put that on top and you have those holes going deep down into that root system, it can go directly down with water, with air, and just will enhance the health. It also will break up that fine layer you get of dead grass, that thatch. And the idea is that it is important to dethatch in the spring, but the insulative value you get from that, you want to penetrate past it, but you want to leave as much of it intact as you can, just for the added value. Fertilization is an important consideration, similar to how and what strategy you're looking for. Typically in the fall, you're looking a lot more towards potassium and phosphorus. Grass can handle nitrogen, and there are a lot of fall fertilizers that are nitrogen heavy, but the thing to consider in all of the other areas of your yard, if you add nitrogen, you're going to stimulate more green growth. And if we have a frost that kicks in, all that new growth gets stunted, it dies back. And it's a fine balance of adding the appropriate amount of nitrogen in contrast to preparing the roots with potassium and phosphorus. Another consideration, there's kind of a lot of people who just see leaves as a hassle. I personally see them as an incredible value. My approach is I like to leave whatever leaves are in place for a few weeks. With what we're having now, I cleaned mine up a few days ago. I just took my mower, mulched up everything that was in place, and then raked those larger leaves. So what I'm getting is all of the tiny leaves are working their way in between the blades. They're actually replenishing with a lot of minerals. Leaves are incredibly rich in minerals. But the idea is that you don't want to have that solid layer of leaves that's just going to compress and kill whatever living materials underneath. So there is a fine balance of when and how you're using leaves, but predominantly they're much more valuable than not. And breaking them down will allow them to decompose enough that by spring, they're almost gone. And they'll actually feed any ecology through the fall to prepare for winter. So it's a really important consideration when and how you want to leave leaves. In addition, pest and weed control is a very important consideration. It's really effective to get pests and weeds at the appropriate time, because if you can remove, for instance, overwintering material that they normally will colonize in at the right time, they have no chance to survive. The contrast is ladybugs do use leaves predominantly, but they also use hollow stems. So if you're ever cutting back a perennial, you want to try and leave a decent amount, maybe 3 to 6 inches usually, and it depends on what plant it is. But the idea is you want to enhance their ability to survive and limit pests. And ultimately, it's better to have more ladybugs because they will manage the pests if both will increase in population. Another consideration that I'm a big proponent of, because I love weeding as much as everyone else, but technology, there's a time and a place. So I will demonstrate what is called a flame weeder. So this is kind of a home-based little small scale flame weeder cane. So the idea is that you're able to essentially, for less than a second, if you are directing at a plant, there's so much heat stress that there's no mechanism. Plants can adapt to Roundup, weeds can adapt. You can't adapt to 600 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're very helpful. I find them very valuable in patios, for getting rid of grass in between the stones, for edging and keeping a nice clean edge in a garden bed, preventing grass from growing where you don't want it, but then also managing any weeds that might be growing in that area. The other idea is that if you're not harvesting your weeds for tea, by flame weeding them, it essentially desiccates them to the point they just turn brown, decompose, and die in place. And all of those nutrients go right into the soil. So you kind of get a double value. And a lot of people, and the challenge we have in winter is the freeze thaw of Chinooks and a lot of ice buildup. The flame essentially takes it beyond melting the ice and will what's called sublimate it. So it just turns it directly into a gas. The gas evaporates. So you can remove ice very easily from pathways or areas where you don't want that buildup, and much more easily manage. Very difficult to manage with an ice chip, adding extra salt, which can be a negative to your garden. It really just kind of gives you a nice balance, both summer, fall, spring, and winter, to have this effective tool. You can find them pretty much anywhere. The one that I have specifically came from Lee Valley, just because I'm a Lee Valley nerd and all my money is in Lee Valley. It's a pit. You just throw it in and you get cool stuff out of it. No, so this is, they give you everything up to the end, and then it's just simply just like a standard camping propane tank. And that's all you really have. You just screw it in, and then it's nicely balanced, and then you just walk around. So it takes most, if not all, of the hassle out of weeding. There's another enjoyable side effect where if you have dry material, you can kind of cook it, disappears, combusts. What I've found is as you're doing that, it's putting up small amounts of smoke, and that smoke will actually repel bugs. So you can go out into your yard when there's swarms of mosquitoes and you're actually not being attacked by them because you have this nice little protective encasing of smoke kind of thing. Big consideration, obviously, the risk of fire in a drought. So what I recommend, especially with any kind of wood mulch or anything, you can easily just go through your yard with a hose, wet a section, flame that section. There's very little chance because the heat will cause that water to evaporate, but it will actually transfer the heat faster to the plant and will kill that plant much more effectively. And everything else is protected at the same time. So just to review, as you're mowing, slowly reduce over the coming weeks to your first frost date so that you're really managing that effective 2 to 3 inches height by the time frost arrives. You definitely want to aerate, core aeration or manual aeration, whichever you prefer. Just get air in there when you can. Fertilizing in the fall, especially if it's a chemical-based sulfur or horticultural lime, it just gives it the time and the ability to work in without directly affecting while plants are dormant. And then leaf removal, try and leave as small and remove the large as you can. For trees and shrubs, deciduous and evergreens are the big contrast that we have in Alberta. For some reason, people are told you can grow cedars here. I don't know why people believe it, but you'll see a lot of times in the spring this browning, and a lot of times people will think that's windburn and can be to a certain degree. Because an evergreen is green throughout the year, it will actually photosynthesize during the winter. The challenge that we have in Alberta is if we have the warmth come, that plant wants to be active and will start photosynthesizing, but the ground is completely frozen. So there's no ability to pull water from any reserve. And that's usually the only mechanism plants have to mitigate or control what kind of temperature range they're going to interact with. So what ends up happening is you basically have them dry out. So there are things like anti-desiccant sprays, which are kind of oil sprays that will protect the outer coating. And then of course, burlap wrapping is one of the best solutions because it will limit that photosynthesis in the winter, but the end benefit is much more positive for the plant when it gets back into the active growing season. So when you're thinking of pruning, there's a lot of depth, which is why arborists charge an arm and a leg. When you think of a tree, a shrub, any kind of larger plant, there's a form and a structure it wants to take. Following that and adhering to that, and the type, as it's called, you can find all the way from tiny little plants all the way up to large trees. Essentially what you're looking for is any dead, damaged, or diseased material can always be removed, no matter the time, the place, because the idea is that it's going to be detrimental. It will be an avenue which some kind of bad disease like black knot can get into these tiny little stubs that might be left by improperly pruning. So there's a few considerations. I can definitely offer more information, but there's a lot of depth into how and where to prune effectively to stimulate growth and to make sure that a plant can recover after you've removed a branch or limb. One of the biggest considerations is what's called the collar. which if you look at a stem, you'll see kind of a little ridge on the base. And in nature, when a branch falls off, these are designed to grow on top of and sometimes encase that stem that has fallen off. And if you cut into that collar, there's no mechanism for that growth to fully encompass. So you end up with these openings that can be vectors for disease right directly into the trunk or stem of a tree. 30% is the general concept to follow, size and area wise, where if you take more than 30% of a plant, you will put it into shock. If you take less than 30%, you will stimulate growth. So there's a very, very fine balance of, if you want to enhance the growth, in the spring, you prune to stimulate growth because it has all these tiny little growing points, and all the nutrients from that full size went into the roots. If you prune in the spring, all of those nutrients come up and will just drive massive new growth everywhere. If you prune in the fall, what you end up doing is limiting the amount of material that's going to go into the roots, and you can much more effectively control the shape of a plant. So you prune for shape in fall, you prune for growth in spring. The added benefit, as soon as leaf drops, you can clearly see the whole layout of your tree. You can see where some branches might be crossing or causing physical contact. And a big consideration there is that friction will open up the bark and be a vector now where a disease can come in. So removing things like crossing, inner growth, where you really want to have outer growth. Inner growth will limit airflow, and that's where we see a lot of black knot especially, or any kind of fungus that's looking for that kind of humid, moist, calm area. And if you open that up to air, nothing can really establish because those aren't the conditions it will be advantageous for it to survive. Dutch elm disease is something I have to make note of. Elms have specific pruning protocols. You have to ensure that they're dormant. There's no exception. You can get special licenses that allow you to prune because Dutch elm disease is such a prevalent issue we're having now in Alberta. It's something you really want to focus on, identifying if you have an elm and then respecting that it needs to be dormant to make any kind of cuts. Otherwise, you can do significant damage to your plants. One thing I do recommend is if you're pruning between plants, sometimes they can transfer disease to each other. And in the case of fire blight, where you see this kind of blistering red open sores on the branch itself, cotton esters especially, but any of the rose family, apple trees, roses, you can see these splitting and opening of the bark. And essentially what that is a bacterial infection that once in place is almost impossible to get rid of other than cutting it out. So I personally use Spray 9. It's a very effective antimicrobial. It's naturally biodegradable. And the idea is that when you use it on any kind of material or metal, if you use a bleach, even a diluted bleach, bleach will actually corrode and start eating away at the metal, and Spray 9 has no effect like that. So it's actually the more preferable sterilization between, especially with fire blight, every single cut has to be sterilized in between with fire blight because it is that easy to just cut and transfer and never, ever prune or trim or cut during wet weather, because water is one of the most effective mechanisms to allow those microbes to move and get into those little advantageous spots. Another point, as I said, pruning is pretty diverse. There is what's called V and L branching. So if you can imagine, sometimes you'll have a slight little stem start growing and it just kind of cuts right in. It isn't like a traditional branch that grows out. Branches that grow directly out, or L branches, have a significant amount of surface area, and the plant can adapt its whole growth pattern around that extra surface area, and they become incredibly strong branches. With V, you lose a lot of the connectivity in that tiny little connection. And what ends up happening is in the winter, the snow can start weighing that off. And because there's nothing really holding the upper portion in place, it'll just snap the branch. So if you're looking at your tree, try and keep the L's, try and reduce the V's. There are international pruning guidelines and protocols. It's top of my head, I think there are 7 different categories of plants. Each have different considerations of how much material you leave going into the fall. They're all very specific to type, and pruning is a art, if you would, that literally is seen in bonsai trees because there is such eloquence in training and moving growth in this plant over time that it really is something you can appreciate for the whole life of the plant. Mulching, definite consideration to help trees and shrubs. 2 to 4 inches is very effective just to insulate the roots, keep them nice and safe. Will significantly enhance water retention, and something that if you have it around just reduces any kind of spread or encroachment of other plants, grasses, and just makes the maintenance of that plant a lot easier to manage. Another consideration is what's called a mulch well. So where the stem might come out of the ground, you want to ridge up the mulch and then bring it down kind of in an M shape. The idea being that extra water can collect and pool, and then it creates this nice little moist ring that just will benefit every part of the root system. Watering is a big consideration in the fall. Plants need to move those nutrients from their leaves, requires a significant amount of energy, and water availability is one of the biggest challenges we have as we start getting into the fall. So if you're watering effectively, you're looking for very moist but not wet soil. And the idea is that if you're able to allow a plant to prepare effectively for that fall transition by giving it extra water, it's a significant advantage it's going to have going into the winter. Wrapping of trees, especially evergreens, is an important consideration. I actually have as an example here, this one's from Home Depot, but they're actually coming out with decorative burlap now. Another thing you can do, some people will want to wrap a plant and then have that kind of Christmas tree feeling. So it's perfectly fine to take that burlap off around the holidays, put either the lights on the burlap itself or take it off, put the lights onto a spruce, conifer, whatever you have. And then essentially you can enjoy it. Just make sure after the holidays, you rewrap that tree or shrub. Deer protection, we're Okotoks. You have to. There's no way around it. So the idea you want to look at with deer protection is the physical barrier, very effective. Any solid fence or solid thing they come across, I'll just jump over it. Having those extensions where you have the lines creates a physical barrier for them that they're less likely to try and jump over. But a lot of times you'll come out in the morning and find a little broken string. A very effective strategy that I came across a few years ago, or a friend of mine told me about it, is essentially you take fishing line, almost impossible to see for the deer. And essentially the deer walks along having its merry little deer life. It doesn't expect to hit anything. So the shock of coming into something stuns it and forces it to run. So it's very easy and effective to repair that line once it's broken, but it's a very effective deterrent just to keep them out of a physical space. In addition to that, there are things called liquid fence, I believe is what it's called in the States. Some people will use Irish Spring soap, the scent deterrent. Deer want to smell attractive plants. A lot of the challenges, people will put that Irish Spring directly in beside their plants, and the deer is already there. It can smell both. It doesn't really care. That's delicious. I'll deal with the scent. What I trialed this year was essentially emulsifying the soap and then creating a physical, like a barrier around. So I consulted the town of Okotoks because it's a natural product, essentially spraying the sidewalk and then the whole perimeter of the house essentially creates this space like a moat that the deer will come up. It's not close enough to any of the plant material to sense that there's anything in that space, and they'll just move on to the next yard. So I used it. I live up in Skotoko, like the housing co-op on the hill, and basically did the whole perimeter. And we had, for the first time, actually a community garden that grew things. Yeah, and the challenge that I had is I wanted to have it be a product that was available to people, knowing that I would have to bring this apparatus with me. So what I actually figured out was a way to take a propane on-demand water heater and a water bypass. So I can basically just hook up to a hose, which is cold, and you can't emulsify the soap in cold water. So what it does is it creates the inlet of cold, splits off to the hot water heater, and then recouples up so that you're left with warm water. And then I have, like, on my big sprayer, there's a bottle you can attach on the bottom. So that's where I put all the soap. And then I can just go. Absolutely. Yep. Because my neighbor, actually, she's the one that gave me the idea, because she just took boiling water.
Yeah.
Right? Just poured it into the shavings and just spread it around her yard. She put it in her mulch, and then they came and ate her plants. So it is important to have that consideration of space and how much. And it's difficult to have a kettle, because you'll have to heat it, and then you'll have to heat it again and have to heat it. But you can always just run hot water long enough to dissolve it. Professional guidance, someone like me, just make sure anyone you're talking to has an understanding of protocols, the depth. They're not in a rush. It's something that they prioritize and respect. So usually any kind of landscaping company or anything like that, I highly recommend ensuring that they just have at least a horticulturalist on staff, someone who understands plants and will give at least some good advice to whatever protocols they're doing. Otherwise, it's challenging paying people minimum wage and pushing them for 14 hours a day to have them care about your plants enough to not do the things that will damage them. So again, pruning, seek a professional. It's fun to learn, very, very rewarding, and I find just incredibly relaxing, because you are thinking 5 years ahead. You're connecting with your tree, your shrub, and you're making this investment in their growth and health. It's very relaxing, very comforting. Mulching, of course, I'll probably say it another 15 times, the value of mulch. Watering effectively to allow the nutrients to move effectively and to prepare for winter. And then wrapping the applicable plants to either protect them physically from moose and deer and rubbing, or specifically for evergreens, just making sure that they don't dry out. Pest control. So one of the biggest issues we have, luckily no rats, great win. Mice and voles especially, do a lot of damage to lawns. They will do what's called girdling. So if you imagine the stem coming up from the ground, what they'll do is they'll eat a ring around the whole base, but only in very tender young plants. So you see it around fruit trees, plants like that. And essentially what happens is the channels that the tree uses in that bark and under the bark to move nutrients and water up and down, what ends up happening is it cuts off that connection. So what ends up happening is you'll have the next year, you might see the nutrients come down, everything looks fine. The year after that, it will suffer significantly. And then the year after that, it's dead. So you can have that upwards of 3 or 4 year old trees. And all you really need to do is put some protective casing around the base of that stem. And it just prevents any mice or voles from physically chewing on the bark. Once they get big enough and have a thick enough layer, the mice and voles can't chew through it. In addition to that, you want to avoid poison. A big issue that not a lot of people are aware of is these mice, these voles are quite visible to predator species. Birds can detect them quite easily, owls, and the challenge is if you're poisoning them, you're really just killing these really amazing birds and creatures. And they're the ones that ultimately will control the population. So if we kill them all off, there's nothing controlling the rodents, and it will just get worse. Scent is a very effective strategy to deter them. There are some irritants. Pepper definitely has an impact on them, but typically it's a predatory scent will really control. So if you have a cat, you'll notice you don't have mice because the mice understand that there's a high risk to where they're living. Crawling insects, we definitely have. Very challenging. Flying insects as well. One of the more challenging is the crawling insects because they're the ones that will seek and find ways into your house. They'll follow the heat, they'll follow food. So really taking an awareness of cleanliness and accessibility can really go a long way. If you do have and are finding that they are an issue, one of the most effective mechanisms is diatomaceous earth, which essentially is just this pulverized shell material from prehistoric crustaceans. And the idea is that these tiny microscopic shards get into the joints in the exoskeleton of those insects and essentially cut them open. And then they will just leak out because they're all gooey on the inside. So what ends up happening is you can very easily have a physical border around your house or in those points where they're coming in. And then again, deer, moose, browsing, like I said before, things like liquid fence. A lot of these have 3 to 4 months of efficacy, even in the winter. And it's just another added layer on top of a physical barrier or something that's going to keep them out of the yard. And once they're in there, they don't want to be in there because they smell some kind of predator scent or something that's very unappealing to them. So we move on to winterization because all the fall prep. And can I double check how much time we have left? Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So for winterization, there's a lot of considerations that we want to prepare for and just have an open mind towards. Insulation, probably the biggest challenge we have. If we lose the snow, there's nothing protecting the root systems. So when you think of zone hardiness and what plants go where, most plants can survive. You can have zone 5, which normally die at -25. If you're protecting the roots, they have no problem. They can recover the upper growth. You might just lose growing points, but it's when the roots go, there's no chance for the plant to come back. Composting is very effective, using that well structure and just keeping that root mass intact and covered, whether by mulch or some other mechanism, is really the best solution you can find to keeping roots intact. In addition, cold protection, so things like cold frames. I have an example here of Lee Valley has a product where essentially they give you these fittings and you can get different sizes of them, but these are just waterline pipe that you would pick up at Home Hardware, Home Depot. You can cut them to length and then you piece them together. And essentially you can build any kind of shape you would like. The largest one I made was a 25 by 30 foot greenhouse, all structurally sound. One day the wind came and picked it up. That was a fun thing to see walking out in the morning. But the idea is I just use vapor barrier, surround the whole thing, and these little clips essentially just couple onto it and hold it in place. Depending on how much wind you have, you can make doors, you can make benches, you can make any kind of structure inside to make that growing space a lot easier and more effective. There is another product that IKEA actually makes, and they no longer make the cover, but I have this for indoor growing, where essentially it comes with the metal frame, which is galvanized, so you can take it out in the summer as well. But for seeds starting and the kits that I have, essentially you can grow different herbs, you can grow lettuces, you can get lettuce mixes. And the idea is that it's all bottom watered, so you don't have to worry about consistently watering it. If there's water in the bottom, it's fine and it will just wick up. But looking into some form of protection that's going to give you that extra layer of insulation. For every layer of plastic or some structure in place, you get about 10 degrees resilience. So you can have greenhouses within greenhouses within greenhouses to really protect sensitive crops into January, into February, because you're just shaving off those heavy -40 down to -30, down to -20, down to where they can actually start surviving.
You could have tropical plants in there in
Mhm.
January.
Yeah.
Without heater.
You would need 7 or 8 layers.
Yeah.
But yes, you're just limiting the wind and limiting the exposure. And then any extra sunlight is trapped and will create this outer layer and then an inner layer and an inner layer. Light bulb? Candles, you can use my favorite's the candle within like a planting, like a terracotta pot. And then that heat radiates out. So you can really just have a small candle that can heat a whole greenhouse and have 2 or 3 of them. Pruning and protection. So again, where I was talking about that V shape that you can get, being aware of what branches might have issues or problems is definitely consideration you can look at in the fall, but keep an eye on how snow load is affecting your tree throughout the whole season. Because if we have a wet enough snow, you can have significant damage both to your tree, but you can also damage other areas of your house, your vehicles, things like that. Garden cleanup, very helpful to have the right kinds of things stay. So getting rid of those leaves, those larger compressing, but leaving stubble. Stubble on a plant just allows snow to catch. It allows a little more insulative value. And if it is for a ladybug, it's that habitat they need to survive through the winter. Everyone's favorite, irrigation, the essential mandatory fee you have to pay each year to have a nice yard. Blow out your lines. Very important. The frost will cause significant damage to the pipes, the fittings. All of that money that you put into high pressure irrigation can very quickly be damaged, and it's all buried. So you don't really know where that problem is without digging up the yard and trying to find. My approach, I use low pressure irrigation only. So essentially, they are pressure fittings that twist and are kind of quick connect. So essentially, you can just kind of just push them into place, and they fit over a ridge. And once that ridge is covered, you just twist them into place. So as opposed to the inner fittings that fit inside the pipe, if this heats up for whatever reason, because usually I just put this right under mulch or just along the side of a walkway kind of thing, and you can bury it under your grass quite easily just by cutting in. Essentially, if you ever have damage, you can just swap out that pipe. As the heat expands that pipe, if it's inside, it'll now slip off. But with this, the hotter this gets and the more it expands, the tighter this will hold. So you end up having whatever mechanism, whatever direction you want to go. They have little shutoff valves. This year I did a full low pressure irrigation for about 1/10 of the price that it would have cost to do full irrigation in someone's yard. They had a lot of retaining walls and a lot of plants intact, and they were very concerned that there would be damage to their plants. And very quickly, within a day, I was able to set it up, no machinery, very easy to approach for most people. And if the fitting isn't going on, you can just use either a little heat gun or even a lighter to just kind of loosen the plastic, and then just slides right in. So some techniques to remember for winterization with burlap, you want to wrap bottom up. So the idea is that each layer will cover the top of the next layer, and then you tie down, just so that it holds on from the tightest point on a conical form. Sometimes if you're doing other trees, you might want to just wrap each individual branch, but at least for conifers and cedars, it's the easiest way to manage them. Again, you can just remove it for Christmas, throw the lights on, take the lights off. Frost blankets, again, you can add water to those frost blankets to have an extra layer of protection to absorb the cold. Raised beds, my favorite by far. I use fabric bags. So the one in there, essentially you can maintain the wood that you put on the outside years more than you would normally have when the soil is in direct contact. And you don't need the same side reinforcement. So you can use more decorative wood and not have it degrade over time. Cloches are amazing. Tiny little clear little covers that you can just drop on specific plants. And indoor growing. Again, I'm pushing a lot more with Grown Home to have more indoor growing options and solutions. Microgreens, sprouting, just to get more nutrients so you don't have to have stuff that's been sitting on a shelf degrading in nutrient quality. It's alive when you eat it and you're getting the highest quality. With, again, irrigation's fun. Never use antifreeze. It can cause damage to plants. It can contaminate your soil. Some people, because you winterize your RV, think that you also do that. So just to clarify, it's something you never would do. You only ever blow them out with compressed air. Make sure you drain your irrigation. This system, every install that I do with this, right at the tap, at the lowest point, there's a little bleeder opening where you just open it up and the whole system drains out. So there's no cost. You can do it in less than 2 minutes. Yes. Make sure to double check if there's any damage to your lines going into winter. Be aware of your irrigation lines. Insulate around connections where there's that exposure coming out of the ground. It definitely helps to add some foam because it can still affect that pipe. Protection components. So again, you want to disconnect any kind of timer, any kind of regulator. You want to make sure that there's no water at all in that system because those are the fine mechanics that are very susceptible to the water. Inspect for damage. And then knowing your frost date, and there's kind of I stick around 5 degrees Celsius. 5 degrees can become a frost if it wants to. It might be in your yard. It might be in a high spot. 5 degrees is my kind of warning area. And next week we're bye-bye, glorious fall. And hire a professional. Blowing lines, you need a specific kind of compressor that can handle the volume and capacity. There are ways you can kind of shortcut it a little bit. But if there's any residual water in there, it will damage this high investment that you've made. And it's always better to just make sure someone who does it effectively can do it for you. So again, make sure you drain and disconnect all your lines, any kind of attachments or timers. Insulate and wrap whatever you can that's exposed. You want to disconnect those timers and seek professional assistance. I always recommend, if you have the budget for it, having either a heat wrap that can go down into your downspout that essentially will allow any ice buildup that you can get. You can plug these in, they'll heat up the inside, and then essentially you can allow that whole system to drain, whereas you otherwise have to wait till spring and the heat to show up. Speaking of spring, I'll go through this pretty quick. But planning is the biggest consideration. Take an inventory of what you have, what you want to grow, and then realize that the recommendations of plant spacing and size were done in the 1940s. You can put plants really close together, especially if they're companions, if they relay crop. There's a layer and complexity to how to utilize much, much more value out of the same amount of space. Maintenance during and preparation for the spring. You want to make sure all your tools are cleaned, sterilized, sharpened. It will do a significant amount to reduce wear and tear on joints and just help you get more value out of the tools that you have, prevent them from breaking. You want to prepare any of the soil that you may have indoors. I typically only recommend sterilized potting mix. I really try and avoid bringing soil from the outside indoors to do any kind of seeding or preparation. Prevention, just making sure again that it's sterilized, but you're on top of any kind of crop rotation based disease that might affect one crop planted in the same spot each year. If you're moving them around and if you're allowing that space, it will affect different nutrients and allow whatever's grown to just kind of be less taxing on that local area as opposed to just growing the same thing in one spot all the time. Garden design. I do garden design with Grown Home. I take a very specific approach, which is that I dial it into exactly what the preference is, color-wise. My grandma grew this. The things that you love, that's what I want to work into a design. Everything is done at full maturity, so it's not like I'm going to put a whole bunch of plants in so I can make some extra money. I want to make sure that they're easy to maintain, they have a healthy amount of space, and that there's a nice diversity where you can have literally blooms in the spring, blooms all the way to the fall, full color, full diversity. And the more plants and the more diverse, the healthier the ecosystem is. And then again, professional assistance, make sure any landscaping company has a qualified designer or someone who understands the nuances of why your eye moves in certain ways or certain plants are focal or why you have a feeling of comfort in a space versus discomfort, because how and where you put plants has a significant effect on the feeling you have in a space. And then very quickly, we live in an amazing place. There's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of difficulties, a lot of ups and downs, but for those who've been here, you get these amazing experiences, you get these really challenging, frustrating experiences, and that's what gardening is about, is overcoming the adversity and enjoying the success. Our short growing season can be optimized. Primarily, I have found by changing the days to maturity in a plant. There are almost every single plant that you can grow, cucumbers, like the large, they have dwarf varieties. They have smaller varieties where you can put more plants in, you can utilize them faster. And if their maturity is 60 days, that might be 40 less days that they're open in a field, exposed to hail, exposed to deer, and you can have high turnover and still get the same quality, still get the same taste, if not even more with heirlooms. Frost dates, biggest consideration, know them, understand that buffer and what you can do to kind of soften the effects of frost or the limitations we may have with drought. Our harsh winters have very difficult issues like insulation and losing all of our snow. Really, again, mulch, 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 mulch. Microclimates, we enjoy two directly in town. We have a river valley and a high hill. We have two completely different spaces. Your yard can have multiple spaces where things will thrive or struggle. Understanding where you see snow collect or not collect, where you see it exposed, where you have that over time, just being aware of how your yard changes each season will let you put the right plants in the right spot. Extending the growing season, having greenhouses, cold frames, indoor growing, whatever we can get, that extra time is quintessential when we have such little time to work with. Soil health, again, the most important factor by far. Everything else is dependent on that. If that isn't in place, your work is a lot more. The plants will struggle a lot more. And anything the soil or the ecology can do to help you is just taken off the table. And then extreme weather. Everybody loves hail. So there are challenges, there are mechanisms, there are things you can do that can really just make gardening easy and enjoyable. And having the right tools and the techniques just really helps you understand how to prevent these challenges that we otherwise have to face. What we've learned: nurture your soil, make sure you have the right crops, protect your garden, maintain woody plants, care for your irrigation, and Alberta's amazing. Thank you.
My microphone on. Okay, so we definitely, thank you, Matt. Thank you so, so much. So we definitely have a bit of time, about 10-15 minutes for questions. I already have one online, but do you guys have any questions for Matt? I can just go grab the online questions too.
Absolutely. Yep.
Before the snow hit,
Mhm.
mowing without the bag on the back, just to let the leaves that are on the front kind of sit on the grass.
That's-
And then, is that what you're saying when you say mowing and leaving kind of the stuff behind?
Yeah, so there's what's called, you'll see the mowers that have a channel, like just the open vent. I try and avoid those just because it's gonna kick everywhere. They're called mulching mowers. So basically it's a closed off system. And usually when you pull the bag off, your mower becomes a mulching mower. And the idea is, yeah, you're just trying to pulverize whatever is there, get it as small as you can. And even just going back and forth over a pile of leaves will knock it down real easily.
Okay,
Can ask the online question
Sure,
now.
yeah.
So going back to pruning, their question is for fruit trees and open center design. Is it possible to avoid the V branching at the top?
The V branching at the top?
The V, yeah,
Yes.
is it, okay.
Yes. So basically the idea is on a branch that comes out of a stem, you can play around with what angles, and by selectively removing ones that might be moving in a certain direction up or down, you can do what's called espalier. So espalier, you'll see them is a central stem and then it just goes sideways. And what you can do is you can actually build a frame in place, secure the branch to it loosely, and the branch will just start growing in that direction. And you'll get that L branching off of a tree. So it really just comes down to be on top of pruning as quickly as you can and understand where you want that plant to go eventually. And then you can build a framework and kind of a skeleton that'll allow you to train it in the direction you want it to go.
Okay, fantastic. I do see someone maybe typing. Oh, that's great. Thanks. Okay,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
answered the question. Okay, anybody else have any questions while we have him?
Yeah, sure, yeah. That's my job. It's just, Yeah.
Evergreen trees that have been planted just a few years ago.
Mhm.
So to burlap them, you do it lightly?
yeah, you don't want to compress a lot of the leaf material. Sometimes you'll have like a branch that might go out a bit. You can kind of just bring it in with the fabric, but you want to have a little bit of flexibility. You don't want to have it too tight, just so that there is still some airflow in there and it can kind of be more comfortable. And then there isn't going to be a lot of physical resistance from that burlap that might cause weathering or damage to the plant itself. Yeah, you're welcome.
What does that burlap actually do? So it's not getting, the snow is not going to be breaking the branches, like if it's a really heavy snow, but what else does it actually do?
So a few of the factors, if you're preventing the light from getting to that evergreen, when you have those times when it's warm enough that it can photosynthesize, it's not getting enough light to actually start driving it to the point that it's going to burn itself out.
Like when it starts budding
Yeah.
in January or something?
Yeah, and where you have that browning because it's trying to pull water out of an ice cube and just doesn't have that capability, it'll just suck everything out from that local area and then die off.
Not also be a bit of a wind resistance where. the wind
100%.
drives out Some of the evergreens.
Yep. You also get the other value, any animal that comes along, it just can't get to a branch. It can't get to anything to chew on. So it'll prevent moose and deer from coming up and either rubbing their antlers off in the fall, or when they're starving in the winter, they'll go somewhere where they can actually eat the branches and eat those growing points because they are quite nutrient dense. It just gives you a physical wind barrier, it gives you the photo barrier, and it gives you that protective encasing from any kind of damage.
Okay, and only evergreens? for the
You
ground.
can use it. I have a client that I've used it on their aspen because they were having big issues with moose chomping it off. So essentially that was a different strategy where I wrapped it starting from the base, the stem. I kind of worked it through because there were 3 coming out of the ground. Worked it around, wrapped it about 3/4 of the way up. And then I wrapped from the top down so that the snow can shed, it can still move around. But I'm getting that, like I had said, where you wrap up, you want the snow to be able to shed off of those upper layers and not get caught if it's coming up the opposite direction and has all these openings that snow can fall in and then pull off.
We have another online question.
Sure, yeah. Keep 'em coming.
Can we plant garlic in fall in a raised bed?
Absolutely. Yep.
Mine in a, ground bed.
Mhm.
And then there's a new community garden in Drake Landing, so it's boxes that are maybe 4 feet high, and then it's on pavement.
Oh, okay.
And the people did not have their garlic. Like they planted in the fall and it did not survive.
The big consideration with raised beds is how well they drain. So usually what ends up happening is if you can have where essentially it dries out, where normally in the ground you would have enough moisture to allow that bulb to continue through.
Yeah.
That's a big consideration is you want to cover and mulch effectively to maintain the moisture and then water a lot more than you normally would in the ground, just because each time it'll sort through and sort through and sort through. You just want to keep it hydrated right up until we actually get good frost, and then it isn't an issue. It is there.
Without damaging your lawn here.
It depends because ammonia has a bioavailability to it. So some forms of like ammonium is detrimental. Ammonia, if it has a certain charge electrically, will interact with plants and ecology in a positive way. So there is this balance where you should test in areas and then kind of get a feel for the effect that it has, play around with concentrations. It's not something I recommend specifically, but if you have that much of an issue with them, you do whatever you can, but you do it in a safe and controlled way and then see how that's transferable to a larger area.
That you buy at Canadian Tire or anywhere. Nothing happened. I tried it on spots here and it killed the grass. So, I don't know.
Because I could see not knowing when and how it was applied. Like if it was applied in a drought, I could see it having much more of an effect than in Ontario where it's a lot more moist.
Yeah.
And there might be a little bit more dilution. That's the challenge. People ask questions and they're like, well, what's my problem? I need a picture. Like I need the context around it. 100%. 100%. That's a successful gardener.
Yes, fertilizer
Oh.
in the fields.
Yep.
So it worked in Ontario.
Absolutely. And there is,
I washed all my evergreens with a solution of ammonia. And never had any problem. I wouldn't dare do it here.
yeah, because it is high concentrated nitrogen,
Yeah.
right? NH4. So it is, but you need to have the right electrical charge because otherwise it becomes a compound that will interact negatively versus positively because ammonia can be picked up by plants and utilized. I definitely would agree. Yeah. Yeah, right.
Was only on a few spots.
No more online questions, and I'm sure we can all kind of stick around too, but I'll close it out for everyone online. I just want to say thank you for everyone who came in person, everyone who came in online, and a big thank you to Matt for joining us today.
Thank you.
I learned a lot, oh my goodness. And I just want to let everyone know that we do have a repair cafe coming this Saturday, the 21st from 12 to noon, or sorry, be very short.
And done.
We're done. 12 to 4. Oh no, I'll think about that. 12 to 4 at the Centennial Arena upstairs in the Olympic Room. So bring anything that you have that might be broken and we'll try our best, or the professionals will try their best to fix it. But that's the next thing coming up. And of course, our Nature Fridays every Friday are here. And our Green Living Workshops next November, and then January we will be skipping December, but hopefully we'll have Matt back in the future. We're already potentially planning some things. So
Yeah.
yes. And thank you. So I'm going to shut down the online, but thank you again.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.